They say children should be seen and not heard. It sounds old-fashioned, almost harmless. But what happens when a child is not seen and not heard? Behind polite smiles and good behavior, there is sometimes a quieter story unfolding. A story of small hands raised but never acknowledged, of feelings that learned to shrink before they could fully form, of questions that dissolved in the air because no one paused long enough to listen. This is not about dramatic abuse. It is about absence, about the silent erosion of a voice. How does a child begin to disappear while still standing in the room? What happens to emotions that are never mirrored back? And how does that silence echo into adulthood? There is a quiet epidemic hidden inside high-functioning adults, the psychology of the unheard child. Today, that silence will be gently explored. Let's begin. Some children are loud, they demand attention, they cry until someone comes, and then there are the others. The ones who learn very early that noise changes nothing. An unheard child is not always neglected in visible ways. There may be food on the table, clothes neatly folded, school attended, smiles exchanged in family photos. From the outside, everything appears intact, but inside the child, something subtle begins to shift. A feeling rises, perhaps confusion, perhaps sadness, and it reaches outward, looking for a face that reflects it back. A pause, a question, a soft "tell me more." Instead, there is distraction, or minimization, or the gentle dismissal of, "It's not a big deal," and so the child studies the room. If emotions create discomfort, perhaps emotions are the problem. If tears are inconvenient, perhaps tears should disappear. This is how silence begins, not as a decision, but as an adaptation. Children are exquisitely sensitive to connection. Their nervous systems are built to scan for belonging. When their inner world is consistently overlooked, they do not assume the caregivers are incapable. They assume something about themselves must be wrong. Maybe feelings are too dramatic. Maybe needs are too heavy. Maybe speaking up makes things worse. So the volume lowers. The unheard child becomes the easy one, the independent one, the mature one. They entertain themselves. They solve their own problems. They rehearse conversations in their heads instead of speaking them aloud. Have you ever noticed how some children stop asking for help long before they truly know how to manage alone? That is not strength. It is strategy. Over time, the child begins to separate from their own emotional signals. Joy is muted. Anger is swallowed. Hurt becomes a private language with no translation. And something even quieter happens. The child starts to anticipate dismissal before it occurs. They edit their stories mid-sentence. They say "it's fine" before anyone can say it for them. They smile to prevent tension. This is not manipulation. It is protection. Because being unheard is not just about silence. It is about invisibility. And invisibility feels dangerous to a developing mind. A child who is unseen learns to survive by becoming smaller than their own feelings. But feelings do not disappear. They settle like sediment at the bottom of a river. Quiet, heavy, waiting. The quiet beginning is not loud enough to alarm anyone. It does not leave bruises. It does not disrupt the household. It simply teaches a child one unspoken rule. Your inner world is too much for this space. And so, it becomes hidden. An unheard child does not grow in isolation. Silence has a history. Behind every emotionally invisible child, there is often a system that never learned the language of feelings. Sometimes the parents were never heard themselves. They were raised in homes where survival mattered more than sensitivity, where emotions were luxuries, where vulnerability was weakness. So when their child cries, they feel overwhelmed, not because they do not care, but because the sound awakens something unresolved inside them. And what a person cannot face within themselves, they often struggle to hold in someone else. Emotional invisibility is rarely intentional cruelty. More often, it is emotional illiteracy passed down quietly through generations. A father who says "be strong" may be repeating what was once told to him when he was breaking inside. A mother who dismisses fear may never have been comforted in her own childhood. This is how silence becomes tradition. Cultural expectations deepen the pattern. In many homes, obedience is valued over expression. Achievement is praised more than authenticity. The good child is the one who does not disturb the emotional climate. But what does that teach a sensitive nervous system? It teaches that love is conditional upon ease, that acceptance depends on compliance, that emotions must be filtered to remain safe. There are also homes where life is simply too heavy: financial stress, marital conflict, illness, exhaustion, parents stretched thin, surviving day by day. In such environments, a child's emotional world can feel like one more demand in an already overflowing well, so the child adjusts, not because they are unloved, but because they sense there is no space. Have you ever walked into a room and immediately felt whether your presence was welcome or burdensome? Children do this instinctively. They read facial expressions, tone shifts, body tension. If their feelings consistently meet distraction or irritation, they begin to internalize a painful equation: my emotions create stress, therefore I must reduce them. Over time, the child stops testing the waters. They no longer reach outward with the same hope. The nervous system learns that vulnerability does not lead to soothing, it leads to discomfort, and so self-reliance becomes identity. The world may praise this independence, teachers may call them mature, relatives may admire how easy they are, but beneath that praise is something fragile. A child who never learned that their emotions matter will grow up believing connection requires self-erasure. Emotional invisibility is not born in a single moment. It is shaped slowly, through repetition, through atmosphere, through what is consistently absent rather than what is violently present. No one sits a child down and says, "Your feelings are not important." Instead, it is communicated in subtler ways, through hurried responses, through unasked follow-up questions, through affection that appears only when the child performs well. And the child adapts beautifully, tragically, because to belong they learn to disappear. A child does not need language to understand connection. The brain understands it long before words exist. From the earliest years, a child's nervous system is searching for one thing: attunement, a face that mirrors their emotion, a voice that softens when they are afraid, a presence that says without words, "Your inner world makes sense here." When a child laughs and someone laughs back, neural pathways strengthen around joy. When a child cries and someone responds with warmth, the brain learns that distress can lead to comfort. This is how emotional regulation is built, not alone, but together. But what happens when the mirror is missing? When sadness meets distraction? When fear meets impatience? When excitement meets indifference? The developing brain does not interpret this neutrally. It does not think, "My caregiver is tired." It thinks, "Something about me is wrong." Attachment theory suggests that children form internal working models based on these early interactions. If emotions are consistently welcomed, the child learns, "I am safe to feel, I am safe to express." If emotions are repeatedly dismissed, the model shifts: "I must manage alone, my needs threaten connection." The nervous system adapts accordingly. Some children become hypervigilant, constantly scanning for shifts in tone, posture, mood. They learn to anticipate reactions before they happen. Safety becomes prediction. Others shut down. Their emotional intensity lowers. They appear calm, composed, unaffected. But beneath that still surface, the stress response quietly activates. Because being unheard is not neutral to the body. When emotions rise and no soothing arrives, cortisol levels increase. The body remains slightly on guard. Over time, this chronic subtle stress teaches the brain that vulnerability equals risk. So pathways form around suppression. The child becomes skilled at self-soothing in isolation. They talk to themselves. They retreat into imagination. They minimize their own experiences before anyone else can. This is not weakness. It is neurological adaptation. Have you ever noticed how some adults struggle to identify what they are feeling? They say "I don't know" when asked about their emotions, not because there is nothing there, but because the brain learned long ago that feelings are safer when unnamed. Neuroscience shows that when emotions are labeled and validated, activity in the amygdala, the brain's fear center, decreases, calm returns. But when emotions are invalidated, the fear center remains active. The body learns to guard itself from its own vulnerability. Over time, the unheard child's brain becomes efficient at one thing: containment. Contain the anger, contain the sadness, contain the longing to be seen. And so silence becomes wired. not as personality, not as preference, but as protection. When a child learns that certain emotions disturb the room, something subtle begins to fracture inside. There becomes a safe self, and a true self. The safe self is agreeable, easygoing, low maintenance. It knows exactly which tones to use, which expressions to soften, which opinions to withhold. The true self, however, is messier. It feels deeply, it longs loudly, it aches to be acknowledged. But when that true self repeatedly meets dismissal, it slowly retreats underground. This is the inner split, not dramatic, not visible, but deeply dividing. The unheard child grows into someone who performs connection rather than experiences it. They become skilled at reading others, adjusting themselves to maintain harmony. Have you ever said it doesn't matter, when it did? Have you ever swallowed a reaction because you feared being too sensitive? This is the echo of that split. On the outside there is composure. On the inside there is negotiation. Should this be expressed? Will this push someone away? Is this feeling valid enough to speak? The mind becomes a filter. Every emotion passes through an internal approval system before reaching the surface. Most do not pass. People-pleasing begins here, not as manipulation, but as attachment preservation. If being authentic once led to distance, then adaptation feels safer than honesty. Over time, hyper-independence can form. I'll handle it. It's fine, I don't need anything. These phrases sound strong, responsible, mature, but often beneath them is a quiet fear. If I need too much, I might be left alone. The inner split creates exhaustion. Because maintaining a safe self requires constant monitoring, the nervous system remains alert, calculating. Who am I allowed to be here? How much of me is acceptable? And the tragedy is this: the true self never stopped existing. It simply learned to wait. It waits in moments of loneliness. It surfaces in quiet resentment. It appears in unexpected tears that feel out of nowhere. But they are not out of nowhere. They are the buried voice tapping gently from beneath years of containment. The unheard child did not lose authenticity. They learned to ration it. Yet a divided self cannot fully rest, because somewhere inside, there is still a question lingering. If I were fully myself, would anyone stay? Childhood does not stay in childhood. It echoes. The unheard child grows up. They become capable, responsible, perhaps even admired. From the outside their life may look stable, friendships maintained, career progressing, relationships formed, and yet something feels slightly out of reach. In conversations they listen more than they speak. When asked, "What do you want?" there is often a pause, not because they lack desire, but because desire was never practiced aloud. Have you ever felt invisible in a room full of people? Not ignored exactly, just not fully known. For the adult who was once unheard, this feeling can become familiar terrain. In relationships they may gravitate toward partners who are emotionally dominant or distracted. It feels normal to adapt, to accommodate, to be the steady one. They become experts at anticipating needs, but expressing their own. That feels foreign, risky. They may fear being too much, too sensitive, too needy, too emotional. So they keep it contained. Conflict becomes uncomfortable, not because they lack opinions but because disagreement once threatened connection. They may apologize quickly, even when they are hurt. They may rationalize their own pain to protect the bond. At work they might excel. After all, productivity is measurable. Achievement earns validation that feelings never did. But praise rarely fills the deeper longing. The longing to be understood, not just evaluated. Sometimes the adult echo shows up as chronic self-doubt, a quiet belief that their inner world is exaggerated. When upset, they might think, maybe I'm overreacting. When disappointed, maybe I expect too much. This internal minimization mirrors what once happened externally. There can also be loneliness, even in committed relationships, not because love is absent, but because vulnerability feels unsafe. They share stories but not the roused parts. They reveal pieces, but not the core, and so intimacy becomes partial. Have you noticed how some people are incredibly supportive to others, yet uncomfortable receiving support themselves? That is the adult echo. Because being heard requires exposure. It requires trusting that someone will stay when the full truth is spoken. And for someone who learned early that emotions create distance, that trust does not come easily. Yet beneath the composure, beneath the independence, beneath the quiet competence, the same longing remains. To be listened to without interruption. To be understood without justification. To be met without shrinking. The child may have adapted beautifully, but the adult still waits for a different ending. Awareness rarely arrives loudly. It does not knock on the door and announce itself. It seeps in. Sometimes it begins with exhaustion, a quiet fatigue from always being the composed one, the reasonable one, the self-sufficient one. Sometimes it begins with a relationship that feels painfully familiar. Once again, needs are unspoken. Once again, emotions are filtered. And somewhere inside a question rises. Why does this keep happening? The turning point is not about blame. It is about pattern recognition. For the first time, the adult begins to trace the thread backward. The discomfort in conflict. The fear of being too much. The reflex to say it's fine. And suddenly, it makes sense. Not as weakness, but as history. There can be grief here. Grief for the child who stopped asking. Grief for the emotions that had nowhere to land. Grief for the moments that seemed small but accumulated like quiet erosion. This grief is not dramatic. It is tender. Have you ever felt sadness for a younger version of yourself? Not because something catastrophic happened, but because something essential was missing. That realization can be disorienting, because it challenges a long-held identity. I was independent. I didn't need much. I was just mature. Now those narratives begin to soften. Independence may have been protection. Low needs may have been suppression. Maturity may have been adaptation. With awareness comes discomfort. Emotions once buried begin to rise. Anger may surface, not explosive, but steady. A quiet recognition that being unheard shaped more than expected. And alongside anger, there is compassion, because the parents were human. Because the system was flawed, because survival required adjustment. The turning point is not about rewriting the past, it is about finally seeing it clearly. When awareness emerges, something subtle shifts inside. The inner split becomes visible. The safe self and the true self are no longer strangers to one another. And for the first time, the adult may ask, what would it feel like to speak, without shrinking? This question alone is powerful. Because awareness interrupts autopilot, it creates a pause between feeling and suppression, a small window where choice begins to exist. The unheard child is no longer entirely unconscious. They are seen now, by the very person who once had to silence them. And that recognition, however quiet, is the beginning of something different. Reclaiming a voice does not begin with volume. It begins with permission. Permission to feel something fully, without immediately editing it. For someone who grew up unheard, expression can feel unnatural at first. There is hesitation, a tightening in the chest, a familiar urge to minimize. It's not that important. Forget it. I'm probably overthinking. But now awareness lingers, and instead of automatically shrinking, there is a pause. What if this feeling matters? Reclaiming the voice is not about confrontation. It is not about suddenly becoming outspoken or unfiltered. It is quieter than that, more internal. It is the slow rebuilding of trust with one's own emotions. For years, feelings were treated as liabilities. Now they are gently reconsidered as signals, not threats, not burdens, signals. Sadness becomes information. Anger becomes a boundary indicator. Longing becomes evidence of desire. Have you ever noticed how unfamiliar it can feel to simply say, "That hurt me"? The words may seem small, but for someone who learned to survive through silence, they are profound. Reclaiming the voice often begins in solitude, in private reflections, in noticing reactions without judging them, in allowing tears without rushing to wipe them away. The nervous system, once wired for containment, begins to experiment with safety in expression. Not everywhere, not with everyone, but somewhere. Perhaps in one conversation where honesty replaces performance. Perhaps in one relationship where needs are stated instead of implied. Perhaps even internally, in the quiet acknowledgement. This matters to me. there may still be fear. Fear of rejection, fear of conflict, fear of being misunderstood. But alongside fear, something steadier begins to form: self-validation. The unheard child once searched outward for confirmation. Now slowly, that confirmation begins within. I am not too much. My emotions are not inconvenient. My voice deserves space. These are not affirmations shouted into the world. They are realizations unfolding gently. Reclaiming the voice does not erase the past. It integrates it. It honors the adaptation that once kept the child safe, while allowing the adult to choose differently. The safe self and the true self begin to merge, and in that merging something softens, because the voice that was silenced was never destroyed. It was waiting, waiting for safety, waiting for acknowledgement, waiting for you to hear it. Silence can make something feel lost, but lost is not the same as gone. The unheard child did not vanish. The voice did not disappear into nothingness. It folded inward. It learned patience. It waited beneath layers of adaptation and composure. And now, with awareness and gentleness, it begins to surface, not as accusation, not as chaos, but as truth. There is something deeply moving about realizing that the parts once silenced were never flaws. They were sensitivities, depth, perception, the very qualities that made connection possible in the first place. Have you noticed how those who are unheard often become the best listeners? How they sense shifts in energy, subtle changes in tone, emotions unspoken. That attunement was born from necessity, but it is also a gift. The difference now is this: listening outward no longer requires silencing inward. The voice that was once hidden does not need to shout to prove its existence. It only needs space, a steady place to land. Healing, then, is not about becoming someone new. It is about returning to someone original. The child who once edited every sentence is slowly allowed to finish it. The emotions once minimized are acknowledged without argument. The needs once denied are recognized without shame. There may still be moments of shrinking. Old reflexes do not vanish overnight. But now shrinking is noticed, and what is noticed can be softened. The unheard child becomes the heard adult, not because the world suddenly changes, but because the relationship with the self does. And in that internal shift, something profound happens. The longing to be seen is no longer desperate. It becomes grounded. Because even if others fail to understand fully, there is at least one steady witness within you. The voice was always there. It was never too much. It was never unreasonable. It was never wrong. It was simply waiting for safety. If this reflection made you feel seen, if parts of this quiet story felt familiar, if something inside you softened, even slightly, you are not alone in this experience. Many carry the weight of being unheard while appearing strong on the outside. Many learn to shrink in order to stay connected. And many are only now beginning to understand why certain patterns feel so deeply rooted. There is nothing broken about you. There is history. There is adaptation. There is a nervous system that did its best to protect connection. If you'd like to stay connected to a space where we gently explore the hidden corners of the human heart, the quiet patterns, the unspoken emotions, the truths beneath behavior, you're welcome here. And if you feel comfortable, you can share your thoughts below, only if you want to. Sometimes your words might help someone else realize they are not alone either. Take care of yourself. You deserve gentleness.